Welcome back to Myth Mental Health. I'm Justin A.Williams, author of Reborn, Virtue's Constellation, which you can get on Barnes & Nobles and Amazon.com and other places where you can get your books online. And so I know it's been a little bit since I posted anything on my YouTube. I do post on my Facebook author page, Justin Williams, quite frequently. I do lives there. I post some content in terms of about my book and about me as an author. And so that's a great place to find me. You can also find me on my Instagram, which is at Professor Jaws. And so today what we're going to talk about is astrology, or the connection between the stars and mythology, particularly in Mediterranean mythology, right? If you've ever seen the movie Hercules, at the end of Hercules, Zeus goes and he takes the image of Hercules and he puts him in the stars, right? If you know anything about Egyptian cosmology, Osiris is Orion. Orion, what we call in the Western world Orion, or Orion's belt, is actually a construction of the Egyptian deity Osiris. And it is that way because they not only wanted to venerate Osiris as being this eternal figure in the stars, but the stars were actually seen as gateways to a place called the Duat. The Duat is the other world, the unseen world, where you pass through to get to, if you're a good soul and your heart is as light as a feather, Rostro, which is the place where Osiris lets you go to continue on living a life, the land of the living, the everlasting. If you can't really synergize it with heaven in the Christian concept, but it would be the Egyptian conception of heaven. And it's important for us to remember that, myth systems like Egyptian or Greek or even Roman are not just typologies that you just transplant one to the other, right? That a typology is like saying, there was a Joseph in the Old Testament that had characteristics, and then you have a Joseph in the New Testament that has very same or similar characteristics. That's typology. With religions, what you really have is not an apples to apples comparison. You really have apples to oranges, because the way that they look at their worldview, while not created often in isolation, the Mediterranean world was not an isolated place. The stories and beliefs of the Phoenicians were definitely connected to the stories of the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Persians, and then the Greeks are connected to the people of the Mycenaean age, Minoan age, and then the Egyptians as well, which influenced the Romans in some ways. But what's important to understand is that these myth systems are unique to each other still, even though there are points of contact. Like I've said before, Socrates, Hesiod, Thucydides, Plato all claim to have studied various years in Egypt. And what's funny about them is that they were often critics of the myths. But myths, in terms of the stars, are quite a good point to look at if you want to look at the synergies between different myth systems. If you want to understand what is similar between all systems of ancient belief, you can look at stellar formations. Stellar formations lead us to not only think about what heroes and gods that different people venerated, but it was also kind of the way they mapped their astrology. They mapped the human existence, right? The stories, the reason why we call Cancer Cancer in terms of the astrological sign, how it relates to Hera, but also how it relates to the crab, right? And the personality of the crab, but also a Greek myth about such a thing. Libra comes from the Libra scales, but it also comes from the goddess Themis. Themis being the goddess that you see who's blind with the scales. She's a Titan too. What we look at in the Western world in astrology still does come from Egyptian and Sumerian beliefs about the cycles of the stars. The Egyptians were able to map out that there are not just stars that just set in the sky, but that they rotate, and that the universe itself in its cosmology is rotating, and that there are changes in sessions of life. If you can look no further for proof of this than in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, obviously, the story of Exodus is a great astrological symbolism, a symbolically astrological story. They are moving on from what they call the golden calf, which could have been Isis, It also could have been Osiris. Osiris is also represented by a calf as Apis, but let's say it's Isis, right? They're moving on from the age of Isis, the golden calf, or the story of what the calf represents astrologically, right? They're moving on from that age into Aries. They're moving on with the ram's horn, and using the ram's horn afterwards, the shofar, right? And then moving on into a new era where there will be the laws delivered from the mountaintop of God, represented by something that actually uses the mountains quite often, which are rams and goats and horned animals, right? So the way of looking at this story is that they are transitioning from belief system about not only what they worship, but what the age, the epoch that they're in represents. And Jesus talks about that the next time you see me, right? He's talking about he's a fisher of men. Well, you could say that perhaps this is during the age of Pisces, right? And I'm sure many people have said this. And then he's transitioning to saying, in a future age, right, where there is the cupbearer will pour out water and you will see me again. It will be the age of Aquarius. That's why the song in the 60s or 70s, I think, was called the age of Aquarius, age of peace and love and light and understanding, all things that Jesus to Christians represents. We see throughout stories, even in the Maya believed that there were different epochs of the sun itself. And we know that the sun goes through its own changes over time. The Maya also believed, I think the Aztecs too, that if you look at the center of the galaxy, where science says there's a black hole, they believe that in that center, that was the center of the underworld, where crueler gods existed. So their worldview of space and time is shaped by their worldview of not only good and evil, but how different epochs and eras affect man in different ways. I found a very interesting thing the other day. Somebody, I think it was Jim Corsetti, was talking about why the Maya became as bloodthirsty as they were before the Spanish got there. Right? Remember, we all know that the Maya were in a downfall from their civilization. They had abandoned most of the ancient sites by the time the Spaniards came. It's probably not true that the Spaniards were the main reason why the Maya as a great empire fell. But we know that the Maya were struggling through a period of feeling abandoned by their deities, which is what you do when you start sacrificing lots of people. It's a desperate move, right? You turn something sacred into profane. But what the Maya were probably doing were focusing on a change in era. That there's a great stela on the walls by one of the old sporting courts that they have, and it shows a transition from a snake age, an age where the snake was venerated. Snakes in most cultures represent wisdom, kingship, a boundary, right? You don't want to cross a snake, but also royalty. Egyptians wore snakes on their cobras on their crowns. The snake is also venerated in Celtic lore as well, as a being of power and not to be troubled with. Snakes in most lore are seen as both not only dangerous, but particularly royal and powerful. They call some cultures call the great Milky Way this way. It's shaped into the great serpent, right? And there's a conflation in some mythologies between whether they talk about dragons or serpents, but usually it's the serpent that is venerated and the dragon that is seen as kind of dangerous. But in any event, the Maya would have seen the serpent as the feathered serpent, and that feathered serpent would have been a benevolent and powerful god that would have led them into wisdom and craft and other good things. But then you see on the stela Jim Corsetti talks about with the eagle, right? And the eagle is represented in the sky too. There's an eagle constellation in the Western world, but the eagle is represented as this kind of descending, bloodthirsty, monstrous kind of thing that which is fine, is interesting, right? But if you think about it, eagles hunt snakes. So clearly, there's going to be a contrast between this era of the serpent and era of the bird, which honestly the Maya would have been able to predict, because the Maya had predictive abilities in terms of how they looked at the stars and how they looked at formations happening within the cosmology of space. Remember, the Maya also had a concept of zero, right? So they were great mathematicians, and I think it's untrue that these societies, like I've said, had no written language. We know the Maya had writing. We know the Aztecs had writing. The Egyptians had writing, and we also know that a lot of cultures that people don't think had writing in different places of the world could have had some form of writing. They just, we haven't found it. Perhaps it was apprehended by colonial powers, or perhaps it just faded away, or they burned it upon seeing what other cultures would do with it. Right? It's important to understand that just like the stars are sacred, but the stars are there permanently. You can't do anything to change that. The knowledge about the stars is not permanent. You can burn that, you can scourge that, you can get rid of it as you'd like. And if your culture was being attacked and about to be apprehended by a culture that you did not respect, you probably would have taken your sacred things and burned them. There's a story about this in North Africa about a woman who was leading a society, and the Arabian or Muslim invasion was happening at that time when Muslims were expanding into the colonization period, I think during the Umayyad Caliphate. And they went, and this woman said, burn all our sacred stuff. Burn it all, because people thought that their writings and that their sacred things were actually empowered. And that if this power was in the wrong hands, right, like people talk about the Ark of the Covenant to relate that to a Western person, then that person can do incredible evil or incredible bad things, not understanding the sacredness of the power, but using that power anyway. So that's a little tangential, but, back to the stars thing. Stars and astrology are often governed by a deity. In Greek thought, there are several deities. There's Astrea, and then there's Asteria. Both are related to the stars in different ways. One is related to the stars in terms of prophecy and propheticness, reading the stars for the future. The other one is more the embodiment of space, the embodiment of the stars. Both kind of have tragic stories in a way that do involve Zeus and his pursuits. Then you also have Calliope, who is the muse of the stars. She wears stars on her crown, talking about how the stars inspire us. And that might be the good way to end this video and talk about Calliope and that kind of musing with the stars, right? That some people see stars, like falling stars, as portents of great events that are going to happen on Earth. Some people see the stars as portends for yourself, right? That's the whole basis of astrology and horoscopes. Being a Libra, being a Gemini, being a Leo. All of this is to say that this will map out some parts of your day and some parts of your future. But all this is governed by some celestial body that even the ancient gods did not control and were privy to. So that's my video for today. And again, I'm Justin A.Williams. You can get my book, Reborn, Virtue's Constellation, wherever books are sold online. And I thank you for listening to this video. If you have any requests, please put them down, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll be back.